Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Race's online investor briefing. My name is Jane Lowe, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Joining me tonight are Dr. Pete Smith, who's Race's Executive Chair. Evening, Pete.
Hello, thanks, Jane.
Hello, and also Dr. Daniel Tillett, who's Race's CEO and Managing Director. Good evening, Daniel.
Good evening, Jane.
So Pete and Daniel will kick off proceedings this evening by delivering an investor update, which of course will cover the recent receipt of ethics approval for Race's RC220 clinical trial. The presentation component should take about 25 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. When we get to the Q&A session, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so using the Q&A ribbon in the bottom of your screen. But for now, I'll pass the floor across to Pete, who will get us on the road with presentation. Thanks, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Let me just get the presentation up for everybody. Yeah, there we go. Right, good. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be able to give you an update and a quick overview of RACE as well. I'm sure most of you on the call, if not all of you, are familiar with the story, but I'll just go through and pull out the key highlights. And for any people from the Emerald Isle, apologies for keeping you away from your Guinness for a little longer, but happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. So we refer to ourselves as being at the heart of cancer care, and obviously, as we'll get to, the reason for that is that we are very, very focused on cancer survivorship, and in particular, cardiotoxicity as a side effect of many different chemotherapies. But so why should people be interested in investing in RACE now? Well, we think the key investment highlights are the fact that the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient in our new formulated drug RC220, has this rich history of clinical success. We know the drug works. We know it's safe. That's been proven in many clinical trials. But we now have our improved drug, the new formulation RC220, which is reformulated to make it much easier to deliver to the patient and therefore access a much, much bigger patient pool than the original developer Ledley felt it was able to reach. And of course, this brings with it 20 years of IP protection, both around the formulation, but also we'll be looking at other IP filings, which we'll be talking about later in the year. We're in the right place at the right time, in that increasingly clinicians are focusing on cancer survivorship, making sure the patients are free of their cancer, but also healthy and able to live full lives afterwards. Previously, there was much more of a focus on getting rid of the tumor, but now we're really focusing much more on the more holistic treatment of the patient. We're going to be talking a lot about the clinical trial today, and there'll be data coming out during the course of the year because it's an open label trial, and we think this is going to drive significant news flow throughout 2025. And we're seeing a bit of a wobble at the moment, given a bit of a flight from risk, mainly driven by a geopolitical situation. But overall, we still feel that the outlook for the sector is positive in hopefully an environment of declining interest rates. And from ourselves, we will continue to be very, very focused on investors, both in the way we conduct our business, how we communicate, but also very much through our funding strategies. So just to recap, the original drug, the active pharmaceutical ingredient in RC220, bisantrene, it was approved in France. So we know this drug is approvable, albeit the historic data and obviously a historic way of looking at the drug, but we're updating all of that through our own clinical work. It delivered excellent patient outcomes across a range of different cancer types, and the data that got it approved in France was a 40% response rate as in the salvage setting in acute myeloid leukemia, something that we've recapitulated through our work with the Sheba Center in Israel. It was also successful in a number of phase 3 studies in solid tumors, including one in breast cancer read out after Ledley discontinued the drug. And that showed that actually bisantrene was, if anything, as good or better than the standard of care, which was doxorubicin in that trial, single agent drugs. So Ledley, because of the problem with delivering the drug, it would crystallize in the blood as soon as it hit physiological pH in a peripheral vein, it would just crystallize. They decided to discontinue it. So just to emphasize again, It wasn't that the drug didn't work. It wasn't that it was safe. It was purely a commercial decision based on the difficulty of actually delivering the drug to patients. So our new formulation, we can now deliver it. We're very, very confident that it's going to be perfectly fine, delivered into the veins of patients who are going to be receiving it very, very soon. We preserve the pharmacokinetics of the drug, so once it's in the blood, it will behave in exactly the same way. It will be around for as long as the original formulation, so we can rely on the historic data. I've mentioned patents already, and we're really going to be talking a lot more later in the year about the mechanism of action and the cardioprotective mechanism in particular. And RC220 in combination with doxorubicin increases the activity. And we've shown that in 85% of all major cancers that we get an improvement in the killing of cancer cells by doxorubicin in combination with RC220. And these on the right-hand side of the slide, these are just some of the significant cancers where this activity is seen. So potentially a very, very wide group of patients who will be able to benefit from RC220 when we get it to market. And importantly, and we'll be talking about this as part of the clinical study, this is an analysis that was done by our team looking at the response to doxorubicin. These are in very late stage patients, so with advanced metastatic cancer. And you can see that the in vitro data being replicated looking at doxorubicin here across a very, very broad range of cancers, so breast, small cell lung, ovary, bladder, etc. So this is the sort of data that we're talking to clinicians about to be able to ensure that they are finding enough patients for our clinical study. And then this is just data on the heart. This is the heart tissue from a mouse. This had received a control, so no drug. With doxorubicin, you can see very, very clearly the gray infiltrate here. This is collagen fibers that have been deposited. It's basically scar tissue. In fact, that's exactly what it is. It's scar tissue. And of course, this is non-functioning tissue. The collagen will not be contracting, and this is why the heart is impaired. In contrast, this is RC220 combination doxorubicin, looking very, very much like the treatment controls. And this has been borne out in animal models looking at the function of the heart in mice treated with doxorubicin and treated with a combination. So let's talk a little bit very briefly on cancer survivorship. And the reason that we're interested in it is because it is exceptionally well known that doxorubicin damages the cardiovascular system. So people have really focused historically on the heart itself, but even with low doses of doxorubicin that are known to be not going to cause heart failure, we see this decline in overall heart function. So the measure is VO2 peak. If you have a VO2 peak of less than 18 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute, which is the metric that's used, you are functionally disabled. This means you are going to struggle to get up a flight of stairs. You're going to struggle to walk to the shops. And what we find is that a significant proportion of patients treated with an anthracycline-containing or doxorubicin-containing regimen will see a decline in VO2 peak of between 8 to 11%. That's an absolute 8 to 11% of previous function. And that's equivalent to about a decade of natural aging. So we're going to be using this measure of VO2 peak along with a number of other measures to look at the protective effect of RC220 in the clinic. And the increased focus is really driven by aging population, so an increase in the incidence of cancer. We're treating the patients better, so there are more of them in the system who've survived cancer, and clearly there's a focus now on reducing the permanent damage that's done to those patients by these genotoxic or poisoning chemotherapies. And we're not just talking about the cardiovascular system. We believe that this extends to other normal tissues as well. Again, a subject of some research that's ongoing at Race. And we need to improve the situation. Doxorubicin is still the most widely used chemotherapeutic. We'll talk about some of the market data later, but we still know it's causing permanent damage. And the current solution is either to not treat patients if they have cardiovascular risks, and that excludes quite a lot of patients, or to just reduce the dose down to a point where basically the patients aren't receiving optimal care. And this is a problem. Patients are either not being treated or they're not getting the optimum dose for treating the cancer. And this is where we see the opportunity. The opportunity is to be able to treat patients who are less well from a cardiovascular point of view. So that'll bring in more patients into the mix, but also be able to hopefully in time deliver a therapeutically more effective dose of doxorubicin and other drugs, because that fear of the cardiotoxicity or cardiovascular toxicity is being reduced. And we're very, very pleased to have Aaron Sverdlov working with us. He's a cardio-oncologist. It's a new specialty focusing on exactly the area that we're working in. So with that brief introduction, I will hand over to Daniel. Daniel.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll talk a little bit about the clinical programs and some more of the detail there. So everyone's got a lot of interest in what the clinical programs is. Pete, next slide. So many of you know we've run 2 phase 2 trials using the original formulation of bisantrene, what we call RC110 in acute myeloid leukemia. Both these trials were run in Israel. The first one was a monoagent trial, 10 patients, 44 of those patients, 40%, had an excellent response rate, complete clinical response rate, and that one was completed in 2000. We followed up with a combination trial where we combined it with clofarabine and fludarabine, two quite toxic nucleoside analogues that are used in leukemia. Also very successful, another 40% response rate. I think our shareholders have noticed this 40% keeps coming up. I think it's been somewhat underestimated how significant those sort of numbers are. And these patients, these are very, very advanced patients. The first trial had a median of 3 prior failed lines of treatment, and the second had a median of 4 previous lines of treatment. 40% response rate in that is extremely impressive. And if we were to run a phase 3 trial, we were to get a 40% response rate, that would be an approvable response. So excellent outcome, and really shows that bisantrene as a drug works. Has some issues or had some issues around deliverability, but certainly not around whether it actually works. And most importantly, whether it'll still work in the modern environment where there's a lot more drugs. Patients are much more heavily treated than they are in the past. And so that's it gives a lot of confidence that when we start to move into other indications, that we can expect to see positive clinical data. So what we're about to undertake, this phase 1 trial, it's a 2-part trial. You could think of this in some ways as a phase 1, 2A type trial, technically, but it doesn't really make any difference. It's more around the data that's collected. This will be looking at cardioprotection as the major focus. Also be looking at M6A levels, very interesting area, also anti-cancer efficacy, and it'll be looked at in a broad range of solid tumours where doxorubicin is indicated as likely to be effective. And so remember back a few slides where Pete sort of showed pretty much all the major solid tumours respond to doxorubicin at quite reasonable rates. So in advanced patients, which you typically don't expect to see massively high rates of response. So we think that there'll be an attractive option for patients who want to participate in this trial. You're likely to get a very effective treatment in the form of doxorubicin. They'll be adding to that with what we hope is a very effective drug in the form of bisantrene, and they'll be protected from the damage to their heart, hopefully, through the use of bisantrene or RC220. So that's a nice combination. And the final one there is the acute myeloid leukemia investigator-sponsored trial. We've spoken about this in the past. We're waiting on receiving a formal request that we can then assess and decide. Until we get that, we can't really talk any more about that. But that sits there as a sort of not necessarily, it's not the most super exciting area compared to the cardioprotection anti-cancer opportunity, but it really is a nice insurance policy, I guess, if you want to think about it from that perspective. If cardioprotection doesn't work out, we still have acute myeloid leukemia. The same thing applies to RC220. There's nothing wrong with RC110. It works very well, as it's been shown in the two phase 2 trials. It's just not suitable for use pretty much outside of acute myeloid leukemia. So if the worst comes to the worst, we've actually still got a pretty good fallback to a lot of those things. And also something we spoke about earlier in the year, actually late last year, getting away from me, was about some of the new work that we've been doing in collaboration with Monash University around developing sort of next generation molecules around that affect the M6A system. Very interesting opportunity areas could be used where bisantrene can't be used. For example, you couldn't use bisantrene for, say, type 2 diabetes or something like that. It's an anti-cancer drug, comes with a lot of toxicity. So you need different molecules. But this area of M6A is a very exciting area. There's a lot of opportunities available in that area, and we're kind of lucky to be in that through what's been discovered around bisantrene. Next slide. Just reminding, I think we spoke a little bit about this. This is, this famous picture I think many of you have seen many times before, of a patient there with extramedullary AML, totally cleared up through one treatment, one cycle of bisantrene as a single agent. That's totally done entirely by bisantrene on its own. Extramedullary AML remains quite a good opportunity, and it could be pursued in the future. It just requires a different approach than and a new clinical trial, but it still continues to retain a lot of interest, and we still talk to clinicians quite regularly about extramedullary AML. And I guess if we had more resources, we might, run an extra trial in this area, but we don't. We work within the resources we have. Next slide. So let's get to the thing that everyone's most interested to know about, which is this phase 1 RC220 open label cardioprotection trial. So the endpoints there are really focused around cardioprotection in up to 53 patients. So this is in the first half, the stage 1 or the A stage of that will be up to 33 patients. We can't actually say precisely how many patients will be in that stage. It's a dose escalation. That means we give different doses of doxorubicin, of bisantrene with doxorubicin, and then we see, okay, how well the patients can handle that combination. So both bisantrene and doxorubicin toxicity, and so there's a limit to how much patients can handle. You can't just put infinite amounts of these drugs together, and so we need to work out what is the appropriate dose to use. This dose escalation has a safety lead-in cycle of bisantrene alone, so the patients will be treated starting at 40 milligrams of RC220, and then escalating up from there. There'll be 5 levels up to the top level, and as we'll progress through that, our expectation based on historical data, our understanding from preclinical studies, is that we expect to reach the tolerable dose level somewhere around the 3rd cycle, the 3rd dose escalation. Of course, if we're really lucky, we'll go all the way to 5. That'd be the fantastic outcome. That means we'd be able to get a lot of bisantrene into patients, or use a lot of RC220, which would be a much better anti-cancer drug. We know from the animal studies that 40 milligrams is equivalent to 1-to-1 molar ratio, and that was an effective dose for protecting the heart from cardiovascular damage caused by doxorubicin. And so that is, the first dose that we're starting at is not a subtherapeutic dose, it's right on the therapeutic dose. So we're really seeing how high we can take it. Once we get through the first cycle, the patient then progresses to further cycles, or up to 6. Typically, that's the limit. It's up to the clinician how many cycles they wish to do. And that will be a combination of bisantrene plus doxorubicin. So what will happen is the patient will be infused first with RC220. As soon as that's gone into them, they then get infused with doxorubicin, and then they come back on a 21-day cycle after they've recovered from treatment. So typically what happens when you get dosed with both these drugs is it attacks your white blood cells and your red blood cells, but typically both of these drugs particularly target the white blood cells. You have a fall off in white blood cells. You reach a low level by day 8 to 10, and then you recover back up, and you're normally back to normal by day 21, and then you're able to then handle the next cycle. With doxorubicin, because of the cardiotoxicity issues, they only go to 4 cycles, except in exceptional circumstances, but you can actually give more cycles than that. So we've allowed that if the patient's responding really well to treatment, that we don't just cut them off. We allow them to continue treatment, provided their heart's looking good, that the cancer's responding well to treatment, shrinking. Why stop treatment? That's the first part of that trial. That's the dose escalation. So up to a total of 33 patients, but more likely somewhere around 15 to 18 patients. Part 2 is really interesting. So the problem with part 1 is these advanced patients can have been previously exposed to doxorubicin, or other anthracyclines. And so we don't really know, if you get exposed to an anthracycline before, you're going to sustain damage to your heart. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to disentangle whether bisantrine's doing anything when you add more doxorubicin to it. In part 2, it'll be anthracycline naive patients. So these patients will have never been exposed to an anthracycline like doxorubicin before. So that any damage, what we'll be seeing there will be, can we protect the normal damage we expect, which is quite severe from occurring by working right from the beginning, from the first dose of doxorubicin, they're getting bisantrine at the optimal dose that we determined from part 1. And that will then continue the same thing. We'll have a combination cycle 1, and then you'll have continuation cycles all the way up to 6. So that's the sort of basic, and then we'll be looking at the heart, focused on that side, collecting VO2 peak, collecting other molecular markers, measuring the heart, doing all the standard heart, cardiovascular things. And we'll also be looking at a whole range of other biomarkers around M6A, anti-cancer efficacy, and a whole bunch around other indications of aging or accelerated aging. Let's see if we can prevent that from occurring during treatment. The start of this is really determined by governance and site activation, and then the first patient on. We expect to be able to get the patients, be ready to recruit first patients in Q1. It's not very long, considering we're almost at the end of the last month of that quarter, but everything is progressing very well. A lot of activities been going on behind the scenes to make everything as efficient and parallelized as possible. And we expect to be able to update the market on the other stages required soon. So we're still on target. We may not make it. It's outside our control, but so far everything remains within the possibility of actually achieving our outcome, which I'd most like to do. I'm looking forward to getting this into patients and seeing if we can make a difference. Next slide, Pete. So where are we going to be doing this? We're going to have up to 4 sites here in Australia. We have 2 sites in Hong Kong. We have 4 sites in South Korea. This has been done for a number of reasons. Number one, we wanted to make sure that we know that RC220 is going to work across multiple different geographical locations. People who are not clinicians are not familiar that there's quite a lot of difference in clinical practice between different countries, and the way they use drugs like doxorubicin varies quite a lot from country to country. Populations are different, and you want to really make sure if you've got a drug, you want to know that it's going to work across a wide range of different markets. You don't want this to be at the end a drug that only works in Australia. That would be, whilst it's great for Australians, it wouldn't be so good from a commercial perspective. So we're going straight away to making sure we have data collected very early on from these different sites. This obviously has important implications for partnering. Obviously, any partner is going to want to know, they're going to say take a regional deal, they're going to want to know that the drug's going to work in the population that they're buying a license to. The final thing is of this, we've been very fortunate in being able to obtain overseas ruling on our R&D tax. And so these sites that we're doing overseas, we're able to claim the R&D tax cost of those. So it's just as cost effective from an investor perspective to run these trials in Hong Kong and South Korea as it is to run them here in Australia. So we capture all the best parts of running these clinical trials. So we're really advancing this. It's unusual for a phase 1 trial to have so many different sites. It's unusual to have combination trials and collect efficacy data up front. But we're really running this to try and get data and proof of concept as soon as we possibly can. because we think that that's really what's going to drive value. That's what's going to drive interest from investors, and interest from investors is obviously going to drive the share price going forward. Market opportunity, it's quite large. So we've spoken about this before in the past. Doxorubicin, just as a generic, we're talking billions of dollars a year, well over $1 billion US. So let's say $2 billion Australian every year as a generic, which sells for, on average, around $100 a cycle for the drug. So it's very cheap. It's very widely used, and that's the reason why, even as $100 a dose, it's very effective. So we undertook some market research back in 22, 23. We asked Triangle Research to look into, what would happen if we had a drug that was cardioprotective and had anti-cancer. What sort of would be the uptake? What sort of prices could we expect to be able to charge without getting pushback from payers like insurance companies and the like? Would clinicians actually use the drug? And that's really important. So there are other drugs out there, like say dexaroxane is a good example, which protect the heart from the damage caused by doxorubicin and other anthracyclines, but it's not used, or almost not used at all. And that's because the fear is it's going to limit the anti-cancer activity of doxorubicin. So clinicians are really, oncologists are really wanting to make sure that, if you're going to add a drug on top of doxorubicin, it better make doxorubicin work better. Otherwise, they're not interested in using it. And so based on that, any pushback to $20,000 per cycle. So that's $80,000 US per patient on a 4-cycle thing. We chose 15 to be conservative. Triangle used the most conservative numbers they could use all the way through on their forecasts. And then they took a 50% reduction across the top, just what if the clinicians happened to state, just to really come up with a really conservative number. And they came out of this at $7 billion. This is not $7 billion valuation. This is $7 billion of sales every year. So that's a very, very significant market. Pharmaceutical companies that sell $7 billion US of a proprietary drug have valuations that are very, very high. So there's a lot of value there. We don't have to achieve very much. That $7 billion is a couple of percent market penetration. The scale of the opportunity you have is as large as you could possibly hope in the pharma industry. So we're playing for a big prize. We're not guaranteed to get there, but if we do, the payoff will be very large. Next slide. You might think, oh, well, chemotherapy is going out of interest. Everyone's interested in targeted agents or immunotherapy, cell therapy. That's true. Chemotherapy as a class of anti-cancer treatment is falling as a percentage every year. But the market for anti-cancer drugs is growing so rapidly through a combination of different things, aging population, a growing population, more of the world's population is able to access treatment for cancer. And then also there's just an overall improvement in diagnosis. And so more patients are being diagnosed with cancer. And so the growth rate in the cancer market is faster than the decline in the use of drugs like anthracyclines. And so the expectation is, and has continued to grow, estimation from different market research firms is sort of in that sort of 5 to 6% a year for the foreseeable future, and probably longer than that if you consider into secondary markets. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of use of these drugs. They will continue to be the backbone of cancer treatment for most patients, even if they might get a targeted agent for first line instead of chemotherapy. When that targeted agent fails, they'll then move on to chemotherapy as a secondary treatment. And so at some point in their treatment journey, will experience an anthracycline at that point if it's an appropriate drug to use for their particular cancer type. So there's still a lot of demand out there. We need to make anthracyclines, if they're going to be used, we need to make them safer and more effective. Next slide. This is not just my opinion or Pete's opinion. Go out and talk to key opinion leaders in the space, oncologists, cardio-oncologists, and people who work in that sort of cardio metabolic space, and you ask them what do they think about the need for this, and they're all unanimous in that there's a need for improving anthracyclines. There's going to be a continued need for these drugs to be used, and if we're going to use them, we need to make them safer and more effective. Next slide. This one, I think most of you are highly familiar with the ups and downs of race. It's obviously over the sort of the last 12 months, it's actually come from quite a low, got down to around 60 cents from memory, as high as $2, and it's sort of been bouncing around in that sort of mid-range. Hopefully, as we start to deliver on all our clinical programs and some of the preclinical activities that are going on within race that we will be able to announce throughout the year, people will start to see actually this actually could be real. And once that happens, things can change very quickly. Many of you lived through the boom times of 2020, 21, where we went from, at the beginning of 2020, I think we were around 10 cents. And then sort of, by early 2021, we were at $4. Those sorts of things happen in this biotech space. Sentiment drives a lot of that, and then results drive it as well. So as clinical results come through, we can expect to see, an improvement, hopefully, in the share price. Of course, there's lots of factors out there that can affect the share price, but we're heading in the right direction. We're doing the right things. As management and as a team, we're focused on delivering on what we're setting out to do, and I think we've got a lot to look forward to over the next couple of years. Or I'm going to say we have an amazing board. I'm the least impressive person on the board, which I like. Really, these people that you have are people who've got a huge amount of experience at all stages, different areas, all complementary to each other, and we work together really as a team. It's really quite amazing. I have to say I'm loving being on a board with this much talent and this much enthusiasm for what we're trying to achieve. So it's I think Race has one of the best boards of any biotech listed on the ASX. Next slide. What can we look forward to over the years? Okay, we've ticked off, we've done the contract, CRO, so the trial's all there, paid for, fully funded. We have ethics approval, which came through last Friday. We can expect to have very shortly governance and first patient. And then we can expect, as the trial progresses, we can expect to get updates. Progress. We're not going to update on every single patient past the first one, but we will at each stage as we go through the cohorts, as we escalate, we'll provide an update how things are going. So you can expect to have results continuously occurring. So you're not just going to be sitting around waiting for years for a double-blinded trial to come through. The Shiva 2 clinical trial results should be published this year sometime. We'll also have additional preclinical results around bisantrine's mechanism of action. And this is not just the cardioprotection, it's also the anti-cancer. We've been doing a lot of work on working out exactly how bisantrine actually works as an anti-cancer drug. It's not just a random killer of cancer cells. It actually works through particular molecular mechanisms of action. And now we're working on exactly how that does that. And that provides us with not only better knowledge of how to use bisantrine, but also where to use it, which cancers would it work best with. And that can really open up a lot of opportunities for the use of bisantrine as an anti-cancer drug. Obviously, an IND is a major focus for us. We don't need one currently because all our trials are either in Australia or Asia, but it will be essential to go forward into the US at phase 2. And obviously, the AML trial, when this, we'll have more to say about that one in the future. A lot of news. And I'd just like to end on, this is kind of not necessarily directly related to exactly what we're doing, but it's really more about how drug development process goes through. In oncology, you've really got a very small chance of your drug that comes from preclinical, so it works in mice or rats, and whether that progresses all the way through to market. It's about 3% of drugs that make it into the clinic, really go through. And there's so many things that can go wrong. In oncology, the most common thing that goes wrong is either the drug's too toxic or it doesn't work at all. So lots and lots of times you've seen we've cured cancer in mice, and then you get to humans and it's very, very difficult to do. So we're blessed with bisantrene and RC220 is we have a drug that we know works. What we've done is solve the problems that prevented it from making it to market, which is the best way. We were able to sort of reverse the problems and solve the problems that are easily solved. Not have to worry about trying to get a drug that just doesn't work at all and trying to make it work. You can run the best clinical trial possible, and if your drug's just not effective in people, then you're going to have a failure, and it can be very, very expensive. A phase 3 trial in oncology can be hundreds of millions of dollars, and you do not want to be invested in a company that fails at phase 3. You want to know that there's a high chance of success. So what we have with RC220 is all the advantages of a new drug, combined with knowing that it's gone all the way through to marketing approval. And that is incredibly valuable, and certainly what attracted me as an investor to Race. I'll end on the key highlights, this de-risked and clinically proven. And I think this is really, really, really underestimated by investors in oncology, but biotech in general. Get excited about the exciting science. It looks really great. Everyone's saying could be the breakthrough that changes everything. But the probability of that really being the case is very small. 90%, 97% chance that it's not going to be. That's not a great base to begin an investment on. We're lucky that we're solving a real and significant health problem. The market for this is very large. It's a real serious problem. Often patients end up worse from their treatment than they started. And it's a problem that's growing due to longevity and increased population growth. So we're not solving a small problem. This is not an orphan problem. This is a mass problem affecting millions of people every year. We're not trying to create a new market from scratch. We're building on an existing very large market, 20 million doses of anthracycline used per year. The sales potential there is massive. We're very lucky because we've got such an innovative approach. We've got this opportunity for a low-cost, rapid pathway to market via accelerated approval. Obviously, we can't make any promises in this area, but from our investigations and comparing it to other drugs that have received accelerated approval, we believe that bisantrene or RC220 has everything required for a regulator like the FDA to grant accelerated approval. And that can come out of phase 2 data. If we run the right phase 2 data, answer the right questions, provide the FDA with a compelling data package, then we put ourselves in every opportunity to get that accelerated approval. And finally, we've got, particularly now, we've really got a management team there that's invested with the proven technical deal and ASX track record to actually make this happen. You can have the greatest science in the world, the greatest drug in the world, and if management's no good, you're still going to end up in a disaster. So we think we've actually got together what's being built at Race is really first class, and the scientists working there really are amazing. And I think that Pete's somebody that him and I often speak about this, about how good the team at Race actually is, and how impressed we both are in their problem solving, their commitment, and their willingness to get in there and make things happen. Without that, success doesn't happen. So I think we're really lucky as investors to have that on our side. And at that point, I'll end it and turn it over to questions.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I'll just remind everyone about the procedure for asking questions. If you'd like to ask one, you can type it in using the Q&A function in the ribbon at the bottom of your screen. Pete had suggested that if we didn't have any questions in the queue, I should ask Daniel to talk about Bayesian statistics, as that conversation could take up some time. Fortunately, we can spare you from that because we've got a lot of questions in the queue. So thanks for your enthusiasm. So we'll start with this one. So how confident are we that bisantrene helps improve VO2 plus peak compared to doxorubicin treated cancer patients?
Do you want me to take that one, Daniel?
Yes, please.
You can have a go at that,
Yeah.
Pete.
So I'd say very confident. Yeah, when we're looking at the heart, we've done a lot of work on the heart, less so elsewhere in the cardiovascular system, because it's actually a little harder to measure. But in terms of animal models demonstrating that protective effect, and then very, very importantly, we have a collaboration with Brian Jensen at University of North Carolina, and he's an expert in this area. And we've done a lot of work on cardiomyocytes, looking at the damage to them. And we see a significant reduction in damage to those cells with the combination compared to doxorubicin alone. So that's human cells. And a lot of work's been done at the University of Wollongong as well, again, in primary cardiomyocytes, which are the muscle cells in the heart. So, yeah, we have to prove it. It has to go and it has to work in the clinic. And there are all sorts of reasons why things that actually work fail in the clinic. So we need to be very mindful of that. But I think the basic biology is very, very robust around that. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Pete. Okay. Were there any concerns from the ethics committee in terms of the biomarkers we have chosen to collect and monitor, or our endpoints? Pete, you look like you're. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say no. It's no question. We were very lucky. The ethics committee had basically no questions about the design of the trial, didn't make any modifications, anything like that. They basically just had queries about technical issues, about things that, and a lot of the time they were things that were already in the application, but they couldn't find them. Like, the problem is these applications are literally thousands of pages, and the poor person reading through it can't expect to find every single technical detail. And so it's very easy. You go, oh, well, and then you just go, okay, well, it's on page X, that's answered. So, yeah, so from that perspective, that's certainly, we had no issue there.
Yeah, so technically it was fine, but, you know, the ethics, I don't know how many times, you know, I've been disappointed by how long it takes to actually get the ethics approval through. But no, there weren't any significant issues at all.
Okay, thank you. So this one's on recruitment. As we expect to recruit any patients with solid tumours, which is unlike the EMD AML trial, which was a rare disease area, could we expect RACE to recruit all the patients in Australia itself, as we are aiming to recruit only 12 to 18 patients, and Hong Kong and South Korea ethics approval timeline is Q3? I think that's two questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, we need to get out there and convince the doctors. You know, that there is this sense that doxorubicin isn't used that much, but actually, you know, the data that we showed earlier on in the presentation, which I don't think we've shown before, indicates there are a lot of cancers where patients can receive a benefit. That is the entry criteria to the trial. It's any patient who can get a benefit from doxorubicin is eligible to come onto the trial. So we're going to really be broadening that. There's partly the doctors, but it's also us going out there and making sure that they fully understand who can come onto the trial. We're getting a lot of interest from the Hong Kong sites, a lot of interest out of the South Korean site. So I think they'll take longer to get on. So there'll be second half of the year. There's a lot of complexities there in terms of translations, and ethics can take longer there as well. But I think, well, it'll be interesting to see where the balance of patients ends up being. Hopefully we get a large number from Australia, but I think we'll also see a lot coming in from South Korea and Hong Kong.
Yeah. What do you put that extra interest down to, Pete? Is it just population, or?
I think it's to do with standards of care in some cases, but also I think just a willingness to get on and treat the patients. A lot of oncologists in Australia tend to be very, very much rules-based. So, you know, they won't go out on a limb and prescribe something just because they've seen some clinical data and think a patient will benefit. They will stick to the guidelines. And whereas in other countries, I mean, I think the Sheba clinical studies is a great example of that. You know, patients were getting treated and 40% of them were having complete responses. And that was in a patient group which almost certainly would not have been treated in Australia because it doesn't fit the guidelines. So there's always a selling job that needs to be done. We're up for that. And I think we've got the material to be able to go and really push this trial ahead rapidly.
Yeah, I would add, like, to that, where the non-use of anthracycline, so things like doxorubicin are very widely used in Australia, but they all used in combination. So using doxorubicin alone, just as a single agent, which is what's required for this trial, is something that's not typically done here in Australia. And so that's the complexity there. But we're looking at patients where the doctors normally wouldn't, as part of standard of care, give doxorubicin on its own. They're looking for patients that have exhausted all other standard of care options. They've run out of options. And the question then is, are the patients going to benefit from getting doxorubicin? And the data suggests, actually, yes, there's actually a really good chance. And then they get bisantrene on top of that. So it's actually quite a good option for a patient that's exhausted all other options. So and that's more difficult to do that in Australia. Australian clinicians are more conservative and more rules-based. Guidelines, not on the guidelines, they don't do it. But that's one of the reasons why we go to different jurisdictions where they're not so rule-based and they're more willing to try things and think about it. And it's really interesting. You talk to Australian clinicians, you get one viewpoint. You go and talk to a Hong Kong clinician, you get a completely different viewpoint. And you think there's the same disease, it's all cancer using the same drugs, and yet they look at it completely differently. So it's one of the sort of de-risking strategies we have. So even if we were extremely lucky and we recruited all the patients here in Australia, we still got the second part of the trial to do, and then we've got the follow-on phase 2. So all of those sites will then become part of that much larger trial. So if we have that problem, that's a problem I would love to have, that we finish the trial so quickly that we don't get the Hong Kong and South Korean sites on before we get through the first part of the trial.
Okay, very good. Now, the question everyone wants to know, can we get a phase 1A result prior to Christmas? When is the earliest we could start phase 1B based on phase 1A trial progress and open label results?
Basically, it's impossible to tell because there's so many variables. We don't know how many steps we're going to go through the dose escalation. So we don't know how many patients. We don't know how rapidly patients will get recruited because that just depends on so many factors. It's just impossible for us to give you an answer to that. We ourselves do not know the answer to this. All we can do is do everything we can to make recruitment as rapid as possible. As Pete mentioned, get out there and make sure that clinicians are fully aware of the opportunity. Try and open as many sites as we can as quickly as possible so that we can get patients in. And my sort of expectation, typically phase 1 trials or any new trial starts slowly because the clinicians are unfamiliar with the drug. As they start to see some successful cases, then suddenly they become much more enthusiastic about it. And that we saw happened with Naglo. It started out slowly, and then as they got more familiar with it, and then recruited faster and up it went. And then, of course, unfortunately, they had a bit of a problem with their neighbours. So that sort of made things difficult. But overall, it's kind of a snowball effect. It's very, very common with clinical trial recruitment. So there's so many factors, you can't answer that.
Okay, well done, not descending into Bayesian trial design specifics.
Yeah, well, that's another level of you can't then detect, you can't even say then at that point.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So will this open label trial considered gold standard, given such trials are expected to be double blind and placebo controlled, Pete?
Yeah, no, you would not expect a trial at this stage to be blinded or controlled like that. The real outcome for this trial is the safety of the doxorubicin bisantrene combination. That is absolutely the gateway to what comes next, and that includes part B, or the second part of the trial. We don't have to wait until the patients have completed their treatment and we've got all the data. It's once we have the safety data, then we can use that to support the expansion cohort. So there may be a bit of a disconnect between when we actually complete that phase and announce that final result of the 1A and when we get into the expansion cohort. But no, yeah, when we get on to trials where we're looking at efficacy and or the cardioprotection, cardiovascular protection, yes, that would need to be controlled and blinded, and we will certainly be going down that pathway.
Yeah.
Okay.
The advantage we have there is we can measure the protection to the heart very quickly after treatment ends, which is really unusual for oncology trials. With oncology trials, you're typically waiting a long time for the patient to progress or, fail and go on to other treatment. And that can take a long time. For example, in breast cancer now, 10 years is kind of what people are expecting from early stage to progression. Many patients just, we have treatments are so good now that they're able to stay healthy for a really long time, and means you're running a trial for an awfully long time. With cardioprotection, you see the damage to the heart straight after treatment finishes. So you don't have to wait a month after treatment's finished, patients recovered from the treatment. You can then measure what happens to the heart. So you have the ability there to get data really early on what really matters. And then you can collect the data on anti-cancer efficacy over time. You can watch those patients for a long period of time, collect the data on anti-cancer efficacy, but you can get the initial data that can allow an approval as a cardioprotective drug and then add to that label later on as an anti-cancer drug. You don't have to do everything at once. You can do it in split forms.
Very good. Okay. So why is the trial design such that part 1 doesn't specify anthracycline naive, but part 2 does? Daniel?
It's purely because you don't need, in the first part, we need to know how this is going to work in anthracycline naive and anthracycline non-naive patients. So we try and make it the first one as broad as possible, get as many patients as could potentially benefit. And then the part 2, we really want to focus in on the cardiovascular damage. So we don't want to have a confusing signal of previous exposure to anthracyclines, which would mess up whether you wouldn't be able to say whether the reason why the Bisantrene is not working to protect the heart is because it's not working, or is it because the patient's previously been exposed to these damaging anthracyclines? So as a consequence of that, it's just, first off, you go as broad as you possibly can in the first stage because you're just looking at getting the safe dose. And then the second part is when you start to focus in on the anti-cancer cardioprotection data and try and collect what you would consider cleaner data that's more interpretable on that. It's not going to be definitive. It's just going to be proof of concept. But you want to have proof of concept. You're pretty confident that this is actually working in humans before you spend all this money running a large phase 2 trial, double blinded and all the rest of it, which is going to then get you all the way to where you want to be.
So there's a related question here, which is, can you provide any more information on the type of patient population, e.g. in terms of indication or other, you're expecting in the 1B, given they will be dox naive and dox is used extensively as standard of care?
Yeah, so it's used extensively, but there's large sections of where they just haven't used it before they get to the stage. So ultimately, where you'd want to be is right up front, where front lined, where it's will get used. So a typical example of this is in breast cancer, where it's used as an adjuvant treatment. The combination there used is what's called AC, combination of doxorubicin plus cyclophosphamide, and that's used after surgery to treat the patient to try and clear up any remaining cancer cells that might be after the majority has been removed through surgery. That's the patient population you kind of want to be in, but to get to that point, you have to kind of stepwise get there. You can't just go straight to the patients that you might want to treat first up. You've got to then start in one population, work on that, collect data, and then that allows you to progress through the treatment program. It's just the nature of clinical research.
Why can't we recruit patients who are taking other drugs in addition to dox?
Yeah, that's because we need a clean toxicity signal. So you don't jump into every combination that's possible, because then we won't really be able to discern what Bisantrene's doing. So the side effect profile of doxorubicin is exceptionally well known. Again, we talked about myelosuppression as being the dose-limiting toxicity there, and obviously heart failure if you keep going with the doxorubicin. So it's really to get a clean look at the tox. That's the primary reason. And then in the future, once we've shown, hopefully, that 220 and doxorubicin looks very similar to doxorubicin, which is, really what we saw in the Sheba trials was with clofarabine and fludarabine. We didn't really see any clear toxicity signal coming from the addition of RC110 in that trial. It was really quite interesting. It was pretty benign. So hopefully it'll come out looking very, very much like dox. And I think, we expect the dox tox to really be the principal feature of the trial. But we need to get that cleanliness of that toxicity analysis.
Okay.
If you don't do things properly at the beginning, you just make a huge mess later on down the track. So this is one where doing things correctly, carefully, systematically up front will save you an enormous amount of time later on the track where you have to go back and redo everything. That's a disaster if you do that. So yeah.
Okay. It's 6:57. We had in mind that we would try to get people off the line at 7 so that they can go and have their dinner or their Guinness or whatever. Maybe we've got a lot of questions left in the queue. Maybe we'll say we'll extend that to 10 past, and then just giving everybody a bit of warning. If we don't get through your questions tonight, then we'll find a way to follow up with you. What are the expected primary outcomes measures required to drive accelerated approval? Are they anti-cancer and cardioprotection, or talk to that?
Yeah, this is a difficult question because you're really asking what does the regulator want. If you look at other companies that have gone through and received accelerated approval, just on cardioprotection alone would get you enough to get accelerated approval based on precedents from other companies. You don't know on the answer of that. So ideally you'd have both. That makes it really compelling, but just cardioprotection, solving the problem of cardiotoxicity that comes from the use of these drugs is, very important. And the regulators recognise that a lot of patients are damaged. They want to see something done about this sort of stuff. So, they're really focused on making sure that we make cancer treatments far less toxic than they actually currently are. And if we can, anything we can do, they're very, very focused on trying to improve that. So, but it's beyond it. It's outside our hands. All we can do is collect compelling data, take it to the regulators and ask them, what do you think? And if they're happy with it, then they go, yep, we'll give you accelerated approval. And if they're not happy, they'll say, go off and do this and this and come back. And it's always a two-way conversation about these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us, Pete, which other cities in Australia, or which of the cities in Australia for the trials?
No, we'll announce that once we've got ethics approval from each of them. That's the sort of protocol for how you do these things. So we don't pre-announce that. But as I said, hopefully we won't be waiting too long to find that out.
Thank you, Daniel. What is institutional approval, and is there a lead time?
Yeah, so it's basically governance or institutional approval. It's basically contract signing. So you have this big contract that's all about how much you're going to pay the site and, who's responsible and whatever. That all has to get signed off on both sides. So it's actually a three-way sign-off, but it's just paperwork. Typically, a lot of that stuff, you can work on it in the time, and we've been doing a lot of that work. So hopefully it won't take very long to get there. So, but it depends a little bit on the site. Some sites are fast. Other sites are slow, and it's a bit unpredictable, a bit like ethics approval.
Okay, there are a few questions on a similar vein here, so I'll try to wrap them up. Will results reporting be in cohorts or at an individual patient level? And while the timeframes are fluid, are you expecting readouts of 1B prior to the options deadline, Pete?
Well, I'm not going to commit on the second part of that question.
Yeah.
No, we won't be making announcements on a patient by patient basis. I think the important data is how a cohort behaves, because that is the gateway then to a higher dose, or stopping and establishing the maximum tolerated combination dose. So I think we'll stick to cohorts and what happens there. And I think the important data will be that the toxicity was not at a level where it was considered to be dose limiting, and therefore we're going on to a higher dose cohort. So I mean, I don't think we've actually discussed this between the board or Daniel and myself, but certainly I don't think you'll see us announcing every patient coming on the trial or every patient result or anything like that. I don't think it's useful information. I think as I said, the information that people want is that we've cleared a dose level and we're going on to another dose level in the part 1. Part 2, obviously it's all going to be about VO2 peak. We'll have to think about when and how we announce that data. And there are plenty of examples of biotechs who come out with what looks like a great result, and then 6 months later it's not looking quite as good, and all of a sudden the shares are tumbling as a result. So you have to be very careful with this, and recognize that even with the completion of the expansion cohort, that's still a relatively small number of patients for a clinical study. So we'll be appropriately cautious on how we interpret that data. But obviously in the expansion cohort, each patient is their own internal control. We've got historic data from work that's been done at the Baker Institute and elsewhere, so we know what we're expecting in terms of what doxorubicin itself will do to VO2 peak. And so we'll be able to make some comparison there. How striking that difference is, who knows? That's what we're doing the study to find out. But based on the animal models, we'd be pretty excited about the prospects of showing a very significant reduction in that damage.
Okay. I've got a great question here, which is not by any means a beginner's question. That's asking it. And one for you, Daniel. I know you'll be excited by this. What happens to bisantrene if doxorubicin ceased to be used?
Nothing, really. Bisantrene is its own independent drug, has a opportunity to be used in combination with doxorubicin, but it has the opportunity to be used in combination with lots of different drugs. And I think many people have been invested in RACE for a while. We've put out a lot of preclinical data about different drug combinations, and it seems to work well with a lot of different drugs. So using bisantrene purely as an anti-cancer drug is a massive opportunity in itself. So in a sense, nothing. It would be, of course, sad if doxorubicin stopped being used, because it's such an effective drug. I don't think it would stop being used because it doesn't work. It would only be stop being used because clinicians decide they don't want to use it anymore.
Yeah.
And hopefully it would not be, it would be not used for the right reasons. So yeah, bisantrene, irrespective of doxorubicin or any other anthracycline, is a very interesting drug with very interesting properties that has a lot of potential as an anti-cancer treatment.
Yeah, and just an amusing anecdote. We were presenting somewhere, I can't remember exactly where it was, but somebody said, "Yeah, chemo is like the All Blacks; they're always there." and I think I think it's very, 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 very unlikely in my lifetime, albeit I am getting on a bit, that we're going to see chemotherapy being removed. We're decades into the development of targeted therapies and immunotherapies as well, and they're still widely used. And that graph showed it was growing. So I think for a lot of patients, they're going to be the backbone of some part of their cancer journey. I don't think there's any one event that's going to dramatically change that. And of course, there really aren't new chemotherapies being developed. So it's not going to be replaced by some other form of broadly acting chemotherapeutic agent. So I think we're reasonably safe in that. How exactly the market evolves, we can't control. But I said, like the All Blacks, I think chemo is going to still be there.
They're pretty strong.
Causing mayhem, hopefully less.
So just again related concerning market opportunity, what was the percentage of penetration that we used for 3%?
3% calculated, yeah. 3% conversion.
Yeah, and second part to that, was that for a particular indication? I think the answer is
broadly wherever doxorubicin. That's the label indication you want to get. You want to get the label indication not for a particular cancer type, and particularly for cardiac protection. It doesn't matter what cancer you've got. Your heart gets damaged by anthracyclines. exactly the same whether you've got lung cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer. Doesn't matter the cancer. What matters for the protection of the heart is, does bisantrene work? So there's no reason to limit it to just one particular cancer type.
Yeah.
Bisantrene works
The
very
secret,
broadly.
yeah.
Yeah.
The secret in oncology is get the drug approved for something. Once it's on the market, the oncologists get hold of it and they will go off and there'll be, cooperative groups doing studies in their particular cancer or in that particular combination or on that earlier stage patient population. It goes wild. But the key thing is to work out that path to get it onto the market, get that approval, get it into the oncologist's hands, and that's when it really starts, spreading. And you see, this is what the KOLs, the key opinion leaders, go and talk about at ASCO and other conferences, is how they're using the drug, and people follow that. So absolutely the key is get it onto the market as quickly as you possibly can, even if it's for a relatively modest patient population. It's getting that first approval that is critical.
Okay. We've got 3 minutes. We're going to take 4 questions, so we're going to smash through them. So,
Okay.
What's the TAM for that AML fallback in considering race fallback value?
Typically, the AML drugs have been selling around $1 billion is kind of the sort of typical. It varies a little bit because there's a lot of subgroups. Bisantrene is pretty broad, so it's not narrowed to a particular subtype. So you could say that's sort of that's a reasonable number to look at. So,
okay, well
seems to say something that small is kind of silly, but that's just the nature of
still a decent number.
Yeah, still a decent number. Everyone would be happy if we only sold $1 billion worth of bisantrene.
Right, you are. Okay, great presentation, great information, lots of exciting news flow coming. Thank you. When will members of the board be purchasing shares on market? Pete, perhaps you can take this one, to show support alongside shareholders who have been tasked with absorbing the supply over the last few years.
Well, ever since I said, I think at a meeting, that I wanted to buy shares, we have not had a trading window open. I can't go into the reasons behind that. But we're working very, very hard to be able to rectify that situation and to open it. I've got a few dollars sitting in a bank account that are earmarked for that. So, I can't speak for Megan and for Serge, but certainly I intend to buy some. And kicking myself, I couldn't have bought some on Thursday, but we probably have ended up in jail had I done so.
Yes. Okay.
Anyway, but I know this is something that people obviously derive a lot of comfort from the board members buying shares. All I can say is that I could have done, I would have done by now. So I'm sure people are going, yeah, whatever. But no, that is actually a truthful answer. So,
okay.
Thanks.
Is Race's commercial plan to license or buy out, Pete? And then Daniel, you can take the last one.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to creating value for shareholders through commercial, let's just call it commercialization, whatever it looks like. I think you just got to be flexible, and I think I think it should be abundantly clear that the data we get from this upcoming trial is going to be really, really critical in terms of our ability to do deals. People want to see that combination as being safe. They want to see some data that supports the hypothesis around the cardiovascular protection. But at that point, I mean, in my mind at least, and I might be hopelessly optimistic, we've got a drug that can absolutely go all the way, because the remaining risk is that combination toxicity and the ability to demonstrate that cardioprotective effect. So it's a phase 1 trial. Okay, we can't change the numbering system on clinical trials, but if you think about the data that we get, it basically just fills in the gaps in terms of the risk. That's the way I'm looking at it. So there's always corporate catastrophe and people screwing up, but I can tell you, we won't be making stupid mistakes on my watch. So because I've made enough of them along the way already, so I've learned quite a bit. So so I think that's the way people should be looking at it. Is not this is a phase 1 trial and therefore an early one. No, this is actually completing the data set that will convince us and hopefully others, including partners, that we've got a drug that can unquestionably go all the way.
Okay, Daniel, 30 seconds or less. Most importantly, how excited is the race team for the next 12 months?
Very. Like, the one thing is, nobody who's working at Race is there just for a job. They all understand, what we've got, the potential of what we've got, and they can make a real difference. We're a small team, and that team performs amazing work, and they know that if they succeed and do their job well, it's going to make a difference to millions of people. So it certainly motivates me, motivates Pete, and motivates the whole rest of the team. So it's actually,
and I think I speak for everybody in the company, including the board. We're enjoying the ride. We're enjoying it.
Well, that is a great note to end on. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thanks for all your extra time, everyone, as well. If you'd like to look at a copy of the presentation that we stepped through, it's on the Race website, also on the ASX. Thanks, Pete and Daniel, for your great presentation, and to everyone who has joined for an engaging discussion. We look forward to keeping you up to date.
Thanks to you, Jane. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the investors who joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.